Voyage to the Moon by Cyrano de Bergerac. Translated by Archibald Lovell. Chapter 1. Of how the voyage was conceived. I had been with some friends at Clamart, a house near Paris, and magnificently entertained there by Monsieur de Cuigy, the lord of it, when upon our return home, about 9 of the clock at night, the air serene, and the moon in the full, the contemplation of that bright luminary furnished us with such variety of thoughts as made the way seem shorter than indeed it was. Our eyes being fixed upon that stately planet, every one spoke what he thought of it. One would needs have it be a garret window of heaven. Another presently affirmed that it was the pan whereupon Diana smoothed Apollo's bands, while another was of opinion that it might very well be the sun himself, who, putting his locks up under his cap at night, peeped through a hole to observe what was doing in the world during his absence. "And for my part, gentlemen," said I, "that I may put in for a share, and guess with the rest, not to amuse myself with those curious notions wherewith you tickle and spur on slow-paced time, I believe that the moon is a world like ours, to which this of ours serves likewise for a moon." This was received with the general laughter of the company. "And perhaps," said I, "gentlemen, just so they laugh now in the moon, at some who maintain that this globe, where we are, is a world. But I'd as good have said nothing, as have alleged to them that a great many learned men had been of the same opinion, for that only made them laugh the faster." However, this thought, which because of its boldness suited my humour, being confirmed by contradiction, sunk so deep into my mind, that during the rest of the way I was big with definitions of the moon which I could not be delivered of, insomuch that by striving to verify this comical fancy by reasons of appearing weight, I had almost persuaded myself already of the truth on't, when a miracle, accident, providence, fortune, or what perhaps some may call vision, others fiction, whimsy, or, if you will, folly, furnished me with an occasion that engaged me into this discourse. Being come home, I went up into my closet, where I found a book open upon the table, which I had not put there. It was a piece of Cardanus, and though I had no design to read in it, yet I fell at first sight, as by force, exactly upon a passage of that philosopher, where he tells us, that studying one evening by candlelight, he perceived 2 tall old men enter in through the door that was shut, who after many questions that he put to them, made him answer, that they were inhabitants of the moon, and thereupon immediately disappeared. I was so surprised not only to see a book get thither of itself, but also because of the nicking of the time so patly, and of the page at which it lay upon, that I looked upon that concatenation of accidents as a revelation, discovering to mortals that the moon is a world. "How," said I to myself, having just now talked of a thing, "can a book, which perhaps is the only book in the world that treats of that matter so particularly, fly down from the shelf upon my table, become capable of reason in opening so exactly at the place of so strange an adventure, force my eyes in a manner to look upon it, and then to suggest to my fancy the reflections, and to my will the designs which I hatch? Without doubt," continued I, "the 2 old men, who appeared to that famous philosopher, are the very same who have taken down my book and opened it at that page, to save themselves the labour of making me the harangue which they made to Cardan. But," added I cannot be resolved of this doubt, unless I mount up thither." "And why not?" said I instantly to myself. "Prometheus heretofore went up to heaven, and stole fire from thence. Have not I as much boldness as he? And why should not I, then, expect as favourable a success?" Chapter 2. Of how the author set out, and where he first arrived. After these sudden starts of imagination, which may be termed perhaps the ravings of a violent fever, I began to conceive some hopes of succeeding in so fair a voyage, insomuch that, to take my measures aright, I shut myself up in a solitary country house, where, having flattered my fancy with some means, proportionated to my design, at length I set out for heaven in this manner. I planted myself in the middle of a great many glasses full of dew, tied fast about me, upon which the sun so violently darted his rays, that the heat which attracted them, as it does the thickest clouds, carried me up so high, that at length I found myself above the middle region of the air. But seeing that attraction hurried me up with so much rapidity, that instead of drawing near the moon, as I intended, she seemed to me to be more distant than at my first setting out. I broke several of my vials, until I found my weight exceed the force of the attraction, and that I began to descend again towards the earth. I was not mistaken in my opinion, for some time after I fell to the ground again, and to reckon from the hour that I set out at, it must then have been about midnight. Nevertheless, I found the sun to be in the meridian, and that it was noon. I leave it to you to judge in what amazement I was. The truth is, I was so strangely surprised, that, not knowing what to think of that miracle, I had the insolence to imagine that in favour of my boldness God had once more nailed the sun to the firmament, to light so generous an enterprise. That which increased my astonishment was, that I knew not the country where I was. It seemed to me that, having mounted straight up, I should have fallen down again in the same place I parted from. However, in the equipage I was in, I directed my course towards a kind of cottage, where I perceived some smoke, and I was not above a pistol shot from it, when I saw myself environed by a great number of people, stark naked. They seemed to be exceedingly surprised at the sight of me, for I was the first, as I think, that they had ever seen clad in bottles. Nay, and to baffle all the interpretations that they could put upon that equipage, they perceived that I hardly touched the ground as I walked, for indeed they understood not that upon the least agitation I gave my body, the heat of the beams of the noon sun raised me up with my dew, and that if I had had vials enough about me, it would possibly have carried me up into the air in their view. I had a mind to have spoken to them, but as if fear had changed them into birds, immediately I lost sight of them in an adjoining forest. However, I catched hold of one, whose legs had, without doubt, betrayed his heart. I asked him, but with a great deal of pain, for I was quite choked, how far they reckoned from thence to Paris? How long men had gone naked in France? And why they fled from me in so great consternation? The man I spoke to was an old tawny fellow, who presently fell at my feet, and with lifted up hands joined behind his head, opened his mouth and shut his eyes. He mumbled a long while between his teeth, but I could not distinguish an articulate word, so that I took his language for the maffling noise of a dumb man. Some time after, I saw a company of soldiers marching, with drums beating, and I perceived two detached from the rest, to come and take speech of me. When they were come within hearing, I asked them where I was. "You are in France," answered they, "but what devil hath put you into that dress? And how comes it that we know you not? Is the fleet then arrived? Are you going to carry the news of it to the governor? And why have you divided your brandy into so many bottles?" To all this I made answer, that the devil had not put me into that dress, that they knew me not, because they could not know all men, that I knew nothing of the Seine's carrying ships to Paris, that I had no news for the Marshal de l'Hôpital, and that I was not loaded with brandy. "Ho, ho," said they to me, taking me by the arm, "you are a merry fellow indeed. Come, the governor will make a shift to know you, no doubt on't." They led me to their company, where I learnt that I was in reality in France, but that it was in New France, so that some time after I was presented before the governor, who asked me my country, my name, and quality. And after that I had satisfied him in all points, and told him the pleasant success of my voyage, whether he believed it or only pretended to do so, he had the goodness to order me a chamber in his apartment. I was very happy in meeting with a man capable of lofty opinions, and who was not at all surprised when I told him that the earth must needs have turned during my elevation, seeing that having begun to mount about 2 leagues from Paris, I was fallen, as it were, by a perpendicular line in Canada. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Of his conversation with the Viceroy of New France, and of the system of this universe. When I was going to bed at night, he came into my chamber, and spoke to me to this purpose: I should not have come to disturb your rest, had I not thought that one who hath found out the secret of travelling so far in 12 hours' space, had likewise a charm against lassitude. But you know not, added he, what a pleasant quarrel I have just now had with our fathers upon your account. They'll have you absolutely to be a magician, and the greatest favour you can expect from them is to be reckoned only an impostor. The truth is, that motion which you attribute to the earth is a pretty nice paradox, and for my part I'll frankly tell you, that that which hinders me from being of your opinion is, that though you parted yesterday from Paris, yet you might have arrived today in this country without the earth's turning. For the sun having drawn you up by the means of your bottles, ought he not to have brought you hither, since according to Ptolemy, and the modern philosophers, he marches obliquely, as you make the earth to move? And besides, what great probability have you to imagine that the sun is immovable when we see it go? And what appearance is there that the earth turns with so great rapidity when we feel it firm under our feet? Sir, replied I to him, these are in a manner the reasons that oblige us to think so. In the first place, it is consonant to common sense to think that the sun is placed in the centre of the universe. Seeing all bodies in nature standing in need of that radical heat, it is fit he should reside in the heart of the kingdom, that he may be in a condition readily to supply the necessities of every part, and that the cause of generation should be placed in the middle of all bodies, that it may act there with greater equality and ease. After the same manner as wise nature hath placed the seeds in the centre of apples, the kernels in the middle of their fruits, and in the same manner as the onion, under the cover of so many coats that encompass it, preserves that precious bud from which millions of others are to have their being. For an apple is in itself a little universe. The seed, hotter than the other parts thereof, is its sun, which diffuses about itself that natural heat which preserves its globe. And in the onion, the germ is the little sun of that little world, which vivifies and nourishes the vegetative salt of that little mass. Having laid down this, then, for a ground, I say, that the earth standing in need of the light, heat, and influence of this great fire, it turns round it, that it may receive in all parts alike that virtue which keeps it in being. For it would be as ridiculous to think that that vast luminous body turned about a point that it has not the least need of, as to imagine that when we see a roasted lark, that the kitchen fire must have turned round it. Else, were it the part of the sun to do that drudgery, it would seem that the physician stood in need of the patient, that the strong should yield to the weak, the superior serve the inferior, and that the ship did not sail about the land, but the land about the ship. Now, if you cannot easily conceive how so ponderous a body can move, pray tell me, are the stars and heavens, which, in your opinion, are so solid, any way lighter? Besides, it is not so difficult for us, who are assured of the roundness of the earth, to infer its motion from its figure. But why do ye suppose the heaven to be round, seeing you cannot know it, and that yet, if it hath not this figure, it is impossible it can move? I object not to you, your eccentrics nor epicycles, which you cannot explain but very confusedly, and which are out of doors in my system. Let's reflect only on the natural causes of that motion. To make good your hypothesis, you are forced to have recourse to spirits or intelligences that move and govern your spheres. But for my part, without disturbing the repose of the Supreme Being, who without doubt hath made nature entirely perfect, and whose wisdom ought so to have completed her, that being perfect in one thing, she should not have been defective in another, I say, that the beams and influences of the sun, darting circularly upon the earth, make it to turn, as with a turn of the hand we make a globe to move, or, which is much the same, that the steams which continually evaporate from that side of it which the sun shines upon, being reverberated by the cold of the middle region, rebound upon it, and striking obliquely, do of necessity make it whirl about in that manner. The explication of the other motions is less perplexed still, for pray consider a little. At these words the Viceroy interrupted me. I had rather, said he, you would excuse yourself from that trouble, for I have read some books of Gassendus on that subject. And hear what one of our fathers, who maintained your opinion one day, answered me. Really, said he, I fancy that the earth does move, not for the reasons alleged by Copernicus, but because hell-fire, being shut up in the centre of the earth, the damned, who make a great bustle to avoid its flames, scramble up to the vault, as far as they can from them, and so make the earth to turn, as a turnspit makes the wheel go round when he runs about in it. We applauded that thought, as being a pure effect of the zeal of that good father. And then the Viceroy told me, that he much wondered how the system of Ptolemy, being so improbable, should have been so universally received. Sir, said I to him, most part of men, who judge of all things by the senses, have suffered themselves to be persuaded by their eyes. And as he who sails along a shore thinks the ship immovable, and the land in motion, even so men turning with the earth round the sun have thought that it was the sun that moved about them. To this may be added the unsupportable pride of mankind, who persuade themselves that nature hath only been made for them. As if it were likely that the sun, a vast body 434 times bigger than the earth, had only been kindled to ripen their medlars and plumpen their cabbage. For my part, I am so far from complying with their insolence, that I believe the planets are worlds about the sun, and that the fixed stars are also suns which have planets about them, that's to say, worlds, which because of their smallness, and that their borrowed light cannot reach us, are not discernible by men in this world. For in good earnest, how can it be imagined that such spacious globes are no more but vast deserts, and that ours, because we live in it, hath been framed for the habitation of a dozen of proud dandyprats? How must it be said, because the sun measures our days and years, that it hath only been made to keep us from running our heads against the walls? No, no, if that visible deity shine upon man, it's by accident, as the king's flamboy by accident lightens a porter that walks along the street. But, said he to me, if, as you affirm, the fixed stars be so many suns, it will follow that the world is infinite. Seeing it is probable that the people of that world which moves about that fixed star you take for a sun, discover above themselves other fixed stars, which we cannot perceive from hence, and so others in that manner in infinitum. Never question, replied I, but as God could create the soul immortal, he could also make the world infinite. If so it be, that eternity is nothing else but an illimited duration, and an infinite, a boundless extension. And then God himself would be finite, supposing the world not to be infinite. Seeing he cannot be where nothing is, and that he could not increase the greatness of the world without adding somewhat to his own being, by beginning to exist where he did not exist before, we must believe, then, that as from hence we see Saturn and Jupiter, if we were in either of the two, we should discover a great many worlds which we perceive not, and that the universe extends so in infinitum. "I' faith," replied he, "when you have said all you can, I cannot at all comprehend that infinitude." "Good now," replied I to him, Do you comprehend the nothing that is beyond it? Not at all. For when you think of that nothing, you imagine it at least to be like wind or air, and that is a being. But if you conceive not an infinite in general, you comprehend it at least in particulars, seeing it is not difficult to fancy to ourselves, beyond the earth, air, and fire which we see, other air, and other earth, and other fire. Now infinitude is nothing else but a boundless series of all these. But if you ask me how these worlds have been made, seeing Holy Scripture speaks only of one that God made, my answer is that I have no more to say. For to oblige me to give a reason for everything that comes into my imagination is to stop my mouth, and make me confess that in things of that nature my reason shall always stoop to faith. He ingeniously acknowledged to me that his question was to be censured, but bid me pursue my notion, so that I went on, and told him that all the other worlds, which are not seen, or but imperfectly believed, are no more but the scum that purges out of the suns. For how could these great fires subsist without some matter that served them for fuel? Now as the fire drives from it the ashes that would stifle it, or the gold in a crucible separates from marcasite and dross, and is refined to the highest standard, nay, and as our stomach discharges itself by vomit of the crudities that oppress it, even so these suns daily evacuate and reject the remains of matter that might incommode their fire. But when they have wholly consumed that matter which entertains them, you are not to doubt but they spread themselves abroad on all sides to seek for fresh fuel, and fasten upon the worlds which heretofore they have made, and particularly upon those that are nearest. Then these great fires, reconcocting all the bodies, will as formerly force them out again, pell-mell, from all parts, and being by little and little purified, they'll begin to serve for sons to other little worlds, which they procreate by driving them out of their spheres. And that, without doubt, made the Pythagoreans foretell the universal conflagration. This is no ridiculous imagination, for New France, where we are, gives us a very convincing instance of it. The vast continent of America is 1/2 of the earth, which in spite of our predecessors, who 1,000 times had cruised the ocean, was not at that time discovered. Nor indeed was it then in being, no more than a great many islands, peninsulas, and mountains that have since started up in our globe, when the sun purged out its excrements to a convenient distance, and of a sufficient gravity to be attracted by the centre of our world, either in small particles, perhaps, or it may be also altogether in one lump. That is not so unreasonable, but that Saint Austin would have applauded to it, if that country had been discovered in his age. Seeing that great man, who had a very clear wit, assures us that in his time the earth was flat like the floor of an oven, and that it floated upon the water, like the half of an orange. But if ever I have the honour to see you in France, I'll make you observe, by means of a most excellent celescope, that some obscurities, which from hence appear to be spots, are worlds are forming. My eyes that shut with this discourse obliged the Viceroy to withdraw. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Of how at last he set out again for the moon, though without his own will. Next day, and the days following, we had some discourses to the same purpose. But some time after, since the hurry of affairs suspended our philosophy, I fell afresh upon the design of mounting up to the moon. So soon as she was up, I walked about musing in the woods, how I might manage and succeed in my enterprise, and at length on St. John's Eve, when they were at council in the fort, whether they should assist the wild natives of the country against the Iroquoians, I went all alone to the top of a little hill at the back of our habitation, where I put in practice what you shall hear. I had made a machine which I fancied might carry me up as high as I pleased, so that nothing seeming to be wanting to it, I placed myself within, and from the top of a rock threw myself in the air. But because I had not taken my measures aright, I fell with a sosh in the valley below. Bruised as I was, however, I returned to my chamber without losing courage, and with beef marrow I anointed my body, for I was all over mortified from head to foot. Then, having taken a dram of cordial waters to strengthen my heart, I went back to look for my machine. But I could not find it, for some soldiers that had been sent into the forest to cut wood for a bonfire, meeting with it by chance, had carried it with them to the fort, where after a great deal of guessing what it might be, when they had discovered the invention of the spring, some said that a good many fireworks should be fastened to it, because their force carrying them up on high, and the machine playing its large wings, no body but would take it for a fiery dragon. In the meantime I was long in search of it, but found it at length in the marketplace of Quebec, just as they were setting fire to it. I was so transported with grief to find the work of my hands in so great peril, that I ran to the soldier that was giving fire to it, caught hold of his arm, plucked the match out of his hand, and in great rage threw myself into my machine, that I might undo the fireworks that they had stuck about it. But I came too late, for hardly were both my feet within, when whip! Away went I up in a cloud. The horror and consternation I was in did not so confound the faculties of my soul, but I have since remembered all that happened to me at that instant. For so soon as the flame had devoured one tier of squibs, which were ranked by 6 and 6, by means of a train that reached every half-dozen, another tier went off, and then another, so that the saltpetre taking fire put off the danger by increasing it. However, all the combustible matter being spent, there was a period put to the firework, and whilst I thought of nothing less than to knock my head against the top of some mountain, I felt, without the least stirring, my elevation continuing, and adieu machine, for I saw it fall down again towards the earth. That extraordinary adventure puffed up my heart with so uncommon a gladness, that, ravished to see myself delivered from certain danger, I had the impudence to philosophize upon it. Whilst then with eyes and thought I cast about to find what might be the cause of it, I perceived my flesh blown up and still greasy with the marrow that I had daubed myself over with for the bruises of my fall. I knew that the moon being then in the wane, and that it being usual for her in that quarter to suck up the marrow of animals, she drank up that wherewith I was anointed, with so much the more force that her globe was nearer to me, and that no interposition of clouds weakened her attraction. When I had, according to the computation I made since, advanced a good deal more than 3/4 of the space that divided the earth from the moon, all of a sudden I fell with my heels up and head down, though I had made no trip, and indeed I had not been sensible of it, had I not felt my head loaded under the weight of my body. The truth is, I knew very well that I was not falling again towards our world, for though I found myself to be betwixt two moons, and easily observed that the nearer I drew to the one, the farther I removed from the other, yet I was certain that ours was the bigger globe of the two, because, after 1 or 2 days' journey, the remote refractions of the sun, confounding the diversity of bodies and climates, it appeared to me only as a large plate of gold. That made me imagine that I biased towards the moon, and I was confirmed in that opinion when I began to call to mind that I did not fall till I was past 3/4 of the way. For, said I to myself, that mass being less than ours, the sphere of its activity must be of less extent also, and by consequence it was later before I felt the force of its centre. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Of his arrival there, and of the beauty of that country in which he fell. In fine, after I had been a very long while in falling, as I judged, for the violence of my precipitation hindered me from observing it more exactly, the last thing I can remember is, that I found myself under a tree, entangled with 3 or 4 pretty large branches which I had broken off by my fall, and my face besmeared with an apple that had dashed against it. By good luck that place was, as you shall know by and by, that you may very well conclude, that had it not been for that chance, If I had had 1,000 lives, they had been all lost. I have many times since reflected upon the vulgar opinion that if one precipitate himself from a very high place, his breath is out before he reach the ground. And from my adventure I conclude it to be false, or else that the efficacious juice of that fruit, which squirted into my mouth, must needs have recalled my soul, that was not far from my carcass, which was still hot and in a disposition of exerting the functions of life. The truth is, so soon as I was upon the ground, my pain was gone, before I could think what it was, and the hunger which I felt during my voyage was fully satisfied with the sense that I had lost it. When I was got up, I had hardly taken notice of the largest of 4 great rivers, which by their conflux make a lake, when the spirit, or invisible soul, of plants that breathe upon that country refreshed my brain with a delightful smell. And I found that the stones there were neither hard nor rough, but that they carefully softened themselves when one trod upon them. I presently lighted upon a walk with 5 avenues in figure like to a star, the trees whereof seemed to reach up to the sky, a green plot of lofty boughs. Casting up my eyes from the root to the top, and then making the same survey downwards, I was in doubt whether the earth carried them, or they the earth, hanging by their roots. Their high and stately foreheads seemed also to bend, as it were by force, under the weight of the celestial globes. And one would say that their sighs and outstretched arms, wherewith they embraced the firmament, demanded of the stars the bounty of their purer influences before they had lost anything of their innocence in the contagious bed of the elements. The flowers there on all hands, without the aid of any other gardener but nature, send out so sweet, though wild, a perfume, that it rouses and delights the smell. There the incarnate of a rose upon the bush, and the lively azure of a violet under the rushes, captivating the choice, make each of themselves to be judged the fairest. There the whole year is spring. There no poisonous plant sprouts forth, but is as soon destroyed. There the brooks by an agreeable murmuring relate their travels to the pebbles. There thousands of choristers make the woods resound with their melodious notes, and the quavering clubs of these divine musicians are so universal that every leaf of the forest seems to have borrowed the tongue and shape of a nightingale. Nay, and the nymph Echo is so delightful with their airs, that to hear her repeat one would say she were solicitous to learn them. On the sides of that wood are 2 meadows, whose continued verdure seems an emerald reaching out of sight. The various colours which the spring bestows upon the numerous little flowers that grow there so delightfully confounds and mingles their shadows, that it is hard to be known whether these flowers shaken with a gentle breeze pursue themselves, or fly rather from the caresses of the wanton Zephyrus. One would likewise take that meadow for an ocean, because, as the sea, it presents no shore to the view, insomuch that mine eye, fearing it might lose itself, having roamed so long, and discovered no coast, sent my thoughts presently thither, and my thoughts, imagining it to be the end of the world, were willing to be persuaded that such charming places had perhaps forced the heavens to descend and join the earth there. In the midst of that vast and pleasant carpet, a rustic fountain bubbles up in silver pearls, crowning its enamelled banks with sets of violets, and multitudes of other little flowers, that seem to strive which shall first behold itself in that crystal miroir. It is as yet in the cradle, being but newly born, and its young and smooth face shows not the least wrinkle. The large compasses it fetches, encircling within itself, demonstrate its unwillingness to leave its native soil, and as if it had been ashamed to be caressed in presence of its mother, with a murmuring it thrust back my hand that would have touched it. The beasts that came to drink there, more rational than those of our world, seemed surprised to see it day upon the horizon, whilst the sun was with the Antipodes, and durst not bend downwards upon the brink, for fear of falling into the firmament. I must confess to you that at the sight of so many fine things, I found myself tickled with these agreeable twitches, which they say the embryo feels upon the infusion of its soul. My old hair fell off, and gave place for thicker and softer locks. I perceived my youth revived, my face grow ruddy, my natural heat mingle gently again with my radical moisture, and in a word, I grew younger again by at least 14 years. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. Of a youth whom he met there, and of their conversation, what that country was, and the inhabitants of it. I had advanced half a league through a forest of jessamines and myrtles, when I perceived something that stirred, lying in the shade. It was a youth, whose majestic beauty forced me almost to adoration. He started up to hinder me, crying, "It is not to me, but to God that you owe these humilities." "You see one," answered I, stunned with so many wonders, that I know not what to admire most. For coming from a world, which without doubt you take for a moon here, I thought I had arrived in another, which our worldlings call a moon also. And behold, I am in paradise at the feet of a God, who will not be adored. "Except the quality of a God," replied he, "whose creature I only am, the rest you say is true. This land is the moon, which you see from your globe, and this place where you are is—" Now at that time man's imagination was so strong, as not being as yet corrupted, neither by debauches, the crudity of aliments, nor the alterations of diseases, that being excited by a violent desire of coming to this sanctuary, and his body becoming light through the heat of this inspiration, he was carried thither in the same manner as some philosophers, who, having fixed their imagination upon the contemplation of a certain object, have sprung up in the air by ravishments, which you call ecstasies. The woman, who through the infirmity of her sex was weaker and less hot, could not, without doubt, have the imagination strong enough to make the intention of her will prevail over the ponderousness of her matter. But because there were very few, the sympathy which still united that half to its whole drew her towards him as he mounted up, as the amber attracts the straw, as the lodestone turns towards the north from whence it hath been taken, and drew to himself that part of himself, as the sea draws the rivers which proceed from it. When they arrived in your earth, they dwelt betwixt Mesopotamia and Arabia. Some people knew them by the name of, and others under that of Prometheus, whom the poets feigned to have stolen fire from heaven, by reason of his offspring, who were endowed with a soul as perfect as his own. So that to inhabit your world, that man left this destitute. But the All-Wise would not have so blessed an habitation to remain without inhabitants. He suffered a few ages after that, cloyed with the company of men, whose innocence was corrupted, had a desire to forsake them. This person, however, thought no retreat secure enough from the ambition of men, who already murdered one another about the distribution of your world, except that blessed land which his grandfather had so often mentioned unto him, and to which no body had as yet found out the way. But his imagination supplied that, for seeing he had observed that, he filled 2 large vessels which he sealed hermetically and fastened them under his armpits. So soon as the smoke began to rise upwards, and could not pierce through the metal, it forced up the vessels on high, and with them also that great man. When he was got as high as the moon, and had cast his eyes upon that lovely garden, a fit of almost supernatural joy convinced him that that was the place where his grandfather had heretofore lived. He quickly untied the vessels, which he had girt like wings about his shoulders, and did it so luckily, that he was scarcely 4 fathom in the air above the moon, when he set his fins a-going. Yet he was high enough still to have been hurt by the fall, had it not been for the large skirts of his gown, which being swelled by the wind, gently upheld him till he set foot on ground. As for the 2 vessels, they mounted up to a certain place where they have continued, and those are they which nowadays you call the balance. I must now tell you the manner how I came hither. I believe you have not forgot my name, seeing it is not long since I told it you. You shall know then that I lived on the agreeable banks of one of the most renowned rivers of your world, where amongst my books I led a life pleasant enough not to be lamented, though it slipped away fast enough. In the meanwhile, the more I increased in knowledge, the more I knew my ignorance. Our learned men never put me in mind of the famous Mada, but the thoughts of his perfect philosophy made me to sigh. I was despairing of being able to attain to it, when one day, after a long and profound studying, I took a piece of lodestone about 2 foot square, which I put into a furnace, and then after it was well purged, precipitated, and dissolved, I drew the calcined attractive of it, and reduced it into the size of about an ordinary bowl. After the preparations, I got a very light machine of iron made, into which I went, and when I was well seated in my place, I threw this magnetic bowl as high as I could up into the air. Now the iron machine, which I had purposely made more massive in the middle than at the ends, was presently elevated and in a just poise, because the middle received the greatest force of attraction. So then, as I arrived at the place whither my lodestone had attracted me, I presently threw up my bowl in the air over me. "But," said I, interrupting him, "how came you to heave up your bowl so straight over your chariot that it never happened to be on one side of it?" "That seems to me to be no wonder at all," said he, "for the lodestone being once thrown up in the air, drew the iron straight towards it, and so it was impossible that ever I should mount sideways. Nay, more, I can tell you, that when I held the bowl in my hand, I was still mounting upwards, because the chariot flew always to the lodestone, which I held over it. But the effort of the iron to be united to my bowl was so violent that it made my body bend double, so that I durst but once essay that new experiment. The truth is, it was a very surprising spectacle to behold, for the steel of that flying house, which I had very carefully polished, reflected on all sides the light of the sun with so great life and lustre, that I thought myself to be all on fire. In fine, after often bowling and following of my cast, I came, as you did, to an elevation from which I descended towards this world, and because at that instant I held my bowl very fast between my hands, my machine, whereof the seat pressed me hard, that it might approach its attractive, did not forsake me. All that now I feared was that I should break my neck, but to save me from that, ever now and then I tossed up my bowl, that by its attractive virtue it might prevent the violent descent of my machine, and render my fall more easy, as indeed it happened. For when I saw myself within 200 or 300 fathom of the earth, I threw out my bowl on all hands, level with the chariot, sometimes on this side and sometimes on that, until I came to a certain distance, and immediately then I tossed it up above me, so that my machine following it, I left it, and let myself fall on the other side, as gently as I could, upon the sand, insomuch that my fall was no greater than if it had been but my own height. I shall not describe to you the amazement I was in at the sight of the wonders of this place, seeing it was so like the same wherewith I just now saw you seized. You shall know then that on the morrow I met with the tree of life, by the means of which I have kept myself from growing old. It straightway consumed the serpent, and made him to vanish away in smoke." At these words, "Venerable and holy Patriarch," said I to him, "I am eager to know what you understand by that serpent which was consumed." He, with face a-smiling, answered me thus: "The tree of knowledge is planted opposite. Its fruit is covered with a rind, which produces ignorance in whomsoever hath tasted thereof. Yet this rind preserves underneath its thickness all the spiritual virtues of this learned food. God, when he had driven Adam from this fortunate country, rubbed his gums with this same rind, that he might never find the way back again. For more than 15 years thereafter he did dote, and did so completely forget all things, that neither he nor any of his descendants till Moses ever remembered even so much as the creation. But what power was left of this direful rind at last passed away through the warmth and brightness of that great prophet's genius. I happily met with one among these apples, which through ripeness was despoiled of its skin. Hardly had my mouth watered with it, when universal knowledge penetrated my being. I felt as it were an infinite number of eyes fix themselves in my head, and I knew the means of speaking with the Lord. When I have since reflected on these miraculous events, I have judged that I could in no wise have overcome, by any occult powers of a simple natural body, the vigilance of that seraph whom God has ordained to guard this paradise. But since he is pleased to use second causes, I imagined that he had inspired me to find this means of entering there, even as he thought good to take of the ribs of Adam to make him a wife, though he could form her of earth as well as he did Adam. I remained long in this garden, walking about alone. But in fine, since the angel that was the keeper of the gate seemed to me to be in chief my host here, I was taken with the desire to salute him. In an hour's journey I came to a place where 1,000 lightnings mingled together in one blinding light that served but to make darkness visible. I was not yet fully recovered from this dazzlement, when I saw before me a beautiful young man. "I am," said he, "the archangel whom you seek. I have but now read in God that he had inspired you with the means of coming here, and that he willed you should here expect his pleasure." He talked with me of many things, and told me, among the rest, that the light wherewith I had been amazed was nothing fearful, but that it appeared almost every evening when he went his rounds, seeing that to avoid sudden attack from the evil spirits which may enter secretly at any place, he was constrained mightily to swing his flaming sword in circles all about the bounds of the earthly paradise, and that the light I had seen was the lightnings which the steel of it gave forth. "Those also which you perceive from your earth," he added, "are of my creation. And if sometimes you see them at a great distance, it is because the clouds of some distant region hold themselves in such disposition as to receive an impression of these unbodied fires, and reflect them to your eyes, just as clouds otherwise disposed may prove themselves fit to make the rainbow. I will not instruct you further in these matters, since to be sure the apple of knowledge is not far from hence, whereas as soon as you have eaten, you will know all things even as I. But see you make no mistake, for most of the fruits that hang from that plant are encased in a rind, whose taste will abase you even below man, while the part within will make you mount up to be even as the angels." Elijah had come to this point of the teachings of the seraph, when a little short man came up with us. "This is that Enoch of whom I told you," said my guide to me apart. And even while he finished the words, Enoch offered to us a basketful of I know not what fruits, like to pomegranates, which he had but discovered that same day in a distant coppice. I took some and put in my pockets, as Elijah bade me. Hereupon Enoch asked him who I might be. "That is a matter," answered my guide, "to entertain us at more leisure. This evening, when we have withdrawn, he shall tell us himself of the miraculous particulars of his journey." With these words we arrived beneath a sort of hermitage, made of palm branches, skilfully interlaced with myrtle and orange branches. There I saw, in a little nook, great piles of a kind of floss silk, so white and so delicate that one might take it for the virgin soul of the snow. And I saw distaffs lying here and there, whereupon I asked my guide what use they served. "To spin," he answered me. "When the good Enoch would relax his mind from meditation, he applies himself sometimes to dressing this lady distaff, sometimes to weaving the cloth from which they make shifts for the 11,000 virgins. Surely in your world you have met with that something white which flutters on the winds in autumn about the season of the winter sowings. Your peasant folk call it Our Lady's cotton, but it is no other than the flock that Enoch purges his linen of when he cards it." We made little delay there, and but barely took leave of Enoch, whom this cabin served for his cell. In truth, what made us leave him so soon was this, that he said some prayer there every 6 hours, and it was at least that time since he had finished the last one. As we went forward, I begged Elijah to finish that history which he had begun, of the Assumptions or translations, and I said that he had come, I thought, to that of St. John the Evangelist. Then said he to me, "Since you have not the patience to wait till the apple of knowledge teach you all these things better than I can, I will even tell you. Know then that God—" At this word, in some way I know not how, the devil would have his finger in that pie, or howsoever it came about, so it was that I could not forbear interrupting him with raillery. "I remember that case," said I. "God heard one day that the soul of the evangelist was so loosed from his body, that he no more kept it in but by shutting his teeth hard, and at that moment the hour when he had foreseen that he should be translated hither was almost past. So, having no time to get him a machine made ready for coming, he was constrained to make him suddenly be here without having time to bring him." During all my discourse Elijah bent upon me such a look as would have been fit to kill me, had I then been capable of dying from aught but hunger. "Thou wretch," said he, and drew back in horror, "thou hast the insolence to rail at holy things. Surely thou shouldst not go unpunished, were it not that the All-Wise determines to spare thee as a marvellous example of his long-suffering, a witness to the nations. Get hence, thou blasphemer, go thou and publish in this little world, and in the other, for thou art predestined to return thither, the unforgetting hatred that God bears to atheists." Hardly had he finished this curse when he seized me roughly to drag me toward the gate. When we were arrived beside a great tree whose branches bent almost to earth with the burden of their fruit, "Here," said he, "is that tree of knowledge, where thou shouldst have got enlightenment inconceivable, but for thy infidelity." At that word I feigned to swoon with weakness, and letting myself fall against a low branch, I handily filched an apple from it. And in but a few strides more I was set down outside of that delicious garden. In that moment, being so violently pressed by hunger that I even forgot I was in the grip of the angry prophet, I drew from my pocket one of those apples I had filled it with, wherein I buried my teeth as deep as I could. But so it was that in place of taking one of those Enoch had given me, my hand fell on that very apple I had plucked from the tree of knowledge, which for my misfortune I had not freed of its rind. Scarcely had I tasted it, when a thick cloud overcast my soul. I saw no body now near me, and in the whole hemisphere my eyes could not discern the least tract of the way I had made. Yet nevertheless I fully remembered every thing that befell me. When I reflected since upon that miracle, I fancied that the skin of the fruit which I bit had not rendered me altogether brutish, because my teeth piercing through it were a little moistened by the juice within, the efficacy whereof had dissipated the malignities of the rind. I was not a little surprised to see myself all alone, in a country I knew not. It was to no purpose for me to stare and look about me, for no creature appeared to comfort me. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Being cast out from that country, of the new adventures which befell him, and of the demon of Socrates. At length I resolved to march forwards, till fortune should afford me the company of some beasts, or at least. She favourably granted my desire, for within half a quarter of a league I met 2 huge animals, one of which stopped before me, and the other fled swiftly to its den. Because that some time after I perceived it come back again in the company of above 700 or 800 of the same kind, who beset me. When I could discern them at a near distance, I perceived that they were proportioned and This adventure brought into my mind the old wives' tales of my nurse concerning sirens, fauns, and satyrs. Ever now and then they raised such furious shouts, occasioned undoubtedly by their admiration at the sight of me, that I thought I was e'en turned a monster. At length one of these beast-like men, catching hold of me by the neck, just as wolves do when they carry away sheep, tossed me upon his back and brought me into their town, where I was more amazed than before, when I knew they were men, that I could meet with none of them but who marched upon all four. When these people saw that I was so little, for most of them are 12 cubits long, and that I walked only upon 2 legs, they could not believe me to be a man, for they were of opinion that nature having given to men as well as beasts 2 legs and 2 arms, they should both make use of them alike. And indeed, reflecting upon that since, that situation of the body did not seem to me altogether extravagant, when I called to mind that whilst children are still under the nurture of nature, they go upon all four, and that they rise not on their 2 legs, but by the care of their nurses, who set them in little running chairs and fasten straps to them, to hinder them from falling on all four, as the only posture that the shape of our body naturally inclines to rest in. They said then, as I had it interpreted to me since, that I was infallibly the female of the Queen's little animal, and therefore as such, or somewhat else, I was carried straight to the town-house, where I observed by the muttering and gestures both of the people and magistrates, that they were consulting what sort of a thing I could be. When they had conferred together a long while, a certain burgher, who had the keeping of the strange beasts, besought the mayor and aldermen to commit me to his custody, till the Queen should send for me to couple me to my male. This was granted without any difficulty, and that juggler carried me to his house, where he taught me to tumble, vault, make mouths, and show 100 odd tricks, for which in the afternoons he received money at the door from those that came in to see me. But heaven, pitying my sorrows, and vexed to see the temple of its Maker profaned, so ordered it, that one day when I was tied to a rope, wherewith the mountebank made me leap and skip to divert the people, I heard a man's voice, who asked me what I was, in Greek. I was much surprised to hear one speak in that country as they do in our world. He put some questions to me, which I answered, and then gave him a full account of my whole design and the success of my travels. He took the pains to comfort me, and as I take it, said to me, "Well, son, at length you suffer for the frailties of your world. There is a mobile here, as well as there, that can sway with nothing but what they are accustomed to. But know that you are but justly served, for had any one of this earth had the boldness to mount up to yours, and call himself a man, your sages would have destroyed him as a monster." He then told me that he would acquaint the court with my disaster, adding that so soon as he had heard the news that went of me, he came to see me, and was satisfied that I was a man of the world, of which I said I was, because he had travelled there formerly and sojourned in Greece, where he was called the Demon of Socrates; that after the death of that philosopher he had governed and taught Epaminondas at Thebes; after which, being gone over to the Romans, justice had obliged him to espouse the party of the younger Cato; that after his death he had addicted himself to Brutus; that all these great men having left in that world no more but the shadow of their virtues, he with his companions had retreated to temples and solitudes. In a word, added he, the people of your world became so dull and stupid, that my companions and I lost all the pleasure that formerly we had in instructing them. Not but that you have heard men talk of us, for they called us oracles, nymphs, geniuses, fairies, household gods, lems, larvas, lamias, hobgoblins, naiades, incubuses, shades, manes, visions, and apparitions. We abandoned your world in the reign of Augustus, not long after I had appeared to Drusus the son of Livia, who waged war in Germany, whom I forbid to proceed any farther. It is not long since I came from thence a second time. Within these 100 years I had a commission to travel thither. I roamed a great deal in Europe, and conversed with some whom possibly you may have known. One day, amongst others, I appeared to Cardan, as he was at his study. I taught him a great many things, and he in acknowledgment promised me to inform posterity of whom he had those wonders, which he intended to leave in writing. There I saw Agrippa, the abbot Trithemius, Dr. Faustus, Labros, Caesar, and a certain cabal of young men who are commonly called Rosicrucians or Knights of the Red Cross, whom I taught a great many knacks and secrets of nature, which without doubt have made them pass for great magicians. I knew Campanella also. It was I that advised him, whilst he was in the Inquisition at Rome, to put his face and body into the usual postures of those whose inside he needed to know, that by the same frame of body he might excite in himself the thoughts which the same situation had raised in his adversaries, because by so doing he might better manage their soul when he came to know it. And at my desire he began a book, which we entitled De Sensu Rerum. I likewise haunted, in France, Lamotte le Veillé and Gassendus. This last hath written as much like a philosopher as the other lived. I have known a great many more there, whom your age call divines, but all that I could find in them was a great deal of babble and a great deal of pride. In fine, since I passed over from your country into England, to acquaint myself with the manners of its inhabitants, I met with a man, the shame of his country. For certainly it is a great shame for the grandees of your states to know the virtue which in him has its throne, and not to adore him. That I may give you an abridgment of his panegyric, he is all wit, all heart, and possesses all the qualities, of which one alone was heretofore sufficient to make an hero. It was Tristan the hermit. The truth is, I must tell you, when I perceived so exalted a virtue, I mistrusted it would not be taken notice of, and therefore I endeavoured to make him accept 3 vials, the first filled with the oil of talk, the other with the powder of projection, and the third with aurum potabile. But he refused them, with a more generous disdain than Diogenes did the compliments of Alexander. In fine, I can add nothing to the elegy of that great man, but that he is the only poet, the only philosopher, and the only free man amongst you. These are the considerable persons that I conversed with. All the rest, at least that I know, are so far below man that I have seen beasts somewhat above them. After all, I am not a native neither of this country nor yours. I was born in the sun. But because sometimes our world is overstocked with people, by reason of the long lives of the inhabitants, and that there is hardly any wars or diseases amongst them, our magistrates from time to time send colonies into the neighbouring worlds. For my own part, I was commanded to go to yours, being declared chief of the colony that accompanied me. I came since into this world, for the reasons I told you, and that which makes me continue here is, because the men are great lovers of truth, and have no pedants among them, that the philosophers are never persuaded but by reason, and that the authority of a doctor, or of a great number, is not preferred before the opinion of a thresher in a barn, when he has right on his side. In short, none are reckoned madmen in this country, but sophisters and orators. I asked him how they lived. He made answer, 3,000 or 4,000 years, and thus went on. Though the inhabitants of the sun be not so numerous as those of this world, yet the sun is many times overstocked, because the people being of a hot constitution are stirring and ambitious, and digest much. You ought not to be surprised at what I tell you, for though our globe be very vast, and yours little, though we die not before the end of 4,000 years, and you at the end of 50, yet know, that as there are not so many stones as clods of earth, nor so many animals as plants, nor so many men as beasts, just so there ought not to be so many spirits as men, by reason of the difficulties that occur in the generation of a perfect creature. I asked him if they were bodies as we are. He made answer, that they were bodies, but not like us, nor anything else which we judged such, because we call nothing a body commonly but what we can touch, that in short there was nothing in nature but what was material, and that though they themselves were so, yet they were forced, when they had a mind to appear to us, to take bodies proportionated to what our senses are able to know. And that without doubt that was the reason why many have taken the stories that are told of them for the delusions of a weak fancy, because they only appeared in the night time. He told me withal, that seeing they were necessitated to piece together the bodies they were to make use of, in great haste, many times they had not leisure enough to render them the objects of more senses than one at a time, sometimes of the hearing, as the voices of oracles, sometimes of the sight, as the fires and visions, sometimes of the feeling, as the incubuses, and that these bodies being but air condensed in such or such a manner, the light dispersed them by its heat in the same manner as it scatters a mist. So many fine things as he told me gave me the curiosity to question him about his birth and death. If in the country of the sun the individual was procreated by the ways of generation, and if it died by the dissolution of its constitution or the discomposure of its organs. Your senses, replied he, bear but too little proportion to the explication of these mysteries. Ye gentlemen imagine that whatsoever you cannot comprehend is spiritual, or that it is not at all. But that consequence is absurd, and it is an argument that there are 1,000,000 of things, perhaps, in the universe, that would require 1,000,000 of different organs in you to understand them. For instance, I by my senses know the cause of the sympathy that is betwixt the lodestone and the pole, of the ebbing and flowing of the sea, and what becomes of the animal after death. You cannot reach these high conceptions but by faith, because they are secrets above the power of your intellects. No more than a blind man can judge of the beauties of a landscape, the colours of a picture, or the streaks of a rainbow. Or at best he will fancy them to be somewhat palpable, to be like eating, a sound, or a pleasant smell. Even so, should I attempt to explain to you what I perceive by the senses which you want, you would represent it to yourself as somewhat that may be heard, seen, felt, smelt, or tasted, and yet it is no such thing. He was gone on so far in his discourse, when my juggler perceived that the company began to be weary of my gibberish, that they understood not, and which they took to be an inarticulated grunting. He therefore fell to pulling my rope afresh to make me leap and skip, till the spectators, having had their bellyfuls of laughing, affirmed that I had almost as much wit as the beasts of their country, and so broke up. End of chapter 7.